I tried hard, continued Skarloey, but my old wheels ached. Rheneas understood. It's my turn now, he'd tell me. He was often short of steam, but he always struggled to a station and then rested there. I mustn't stop between stations, he'd say. The passengers wouldn't like it.
Rheneas is a fictional narrow-gauge well-tank locomotive created by the Reverend W. Audrey. He, like Skarloey, is one of the oldest engines on the island of Sodor. He lives and works on the Skarloey Railway and is their number 2 engine. He first appeared in the Railway series book Four Little Engines, which was published in 1955, and his last appearance was in New Little Engine, published in 1996. Rheneas is based on the Tallyclin Railway's number 2 locomotive, Dolgach, or I think it's Dolgach, again, sorry guys, I'm not Welsh, who was briefly named Pretoria, and several historical events that would occur with this locomotive in real life were mirrored with his fictional counterpart, Rheneas. Dolgach has also been used by the Tallyclin Railway to represent Rheneas in real life. In the books, Dolgach is even mentioned as being Rheneas' twin, while Skarloey and Tallyclin are mentioned as being his brothers. In 1995, Rheneas was introduced into the 4th season of Thomas & Friends. This season would place a great focus on him and the other narrow-gauge characters, with a number of the stories from the original books being televised. In the Railway series, all of the Skarloey steam engines were painted red with blue lining, besides Duke. However, in order to make it easier for viewers to identify each engine, Rheneas was painted a darker red with black lining, and the other characters received other liveries. Much like Skarloey, in the classic era of Thomas & Friends, Rheneas is portrayed as an old and wise engine. However, after Rheneas returned to the series in 2005, after an absence of over 8 seasons, he was depicted with more of a childlike attitude, which was when Hit Entertainment took over. It should also be noted that Skarloey and Rheneas have never been referred to as brothers in the television series, but instead they're called friends in most episodes. In the 2012 special, Blue Mountain Mystery, Rheneas would be introduced into the CGI series, more or less regaining that old personality, but before we get into that, we need to get into his models. And what better way to start than with Audrey's model of Rheneas? The Reverend's model of Rheneas was an 009 scale, and was made from a Dolgach kit. Rheneas' model is now on display at the Narrow Gauge Museum in Wales, located at the Tallyclin Railway, along with the other Skarloey Railway engines and rolling stock. But getting into the television series, Rheneas had several models. We'll start off with his O-gauge small-scale model. Rheneas' small model was custom built from brass by model maker Peter Eves. It would run on O-gauge track to scale to the Gauge 1 locomotives a bit better, and would first see use in the 4th season. It was painted using glossy car body paint and lined with gold and black pinstripe taping. His numbers and nameplates were custom printed foil stickers. Rheneas' wheels are actually 10-spokes tramway wheels made by Slater's Plasticard, and these wheels were used on an O-gauge locomotive chassis, with all of the narrow-gauge engine side rods being sourced from old OO-gauge trying models, just being slightly modified to fit. These rods did not fit on the engines well at all, and would notoriously run horribly behind the scenes. Rheneas' small model would have 10 different facial expressions sculpted for it, but only 8 would ever be used on screen. A laughing and surprised face would be left unused. Like most others, the faces were sculpted in clay, and from that resin casts were made of a silicone mold. Rheneas' unused laughing face, which was acquired by Twitter user Thomas Tank Merch, actually supplied it to another Twitter user, TomsProps, after they would acquire the actual small-scale Rheneas prop. So not only are one of those faces okay, but the actual small-scale Rheneas is too, which is something I'm very happy to report. The model had a mower to power it inside of the chassis, as well as an eye mechanism. However, like Skarloey, because of this, there was no room to fit a smoke mechanism or a battery, and that would complicate things, because the RCIs needed a receiver. So usually these were hidden off camera or carried in rolling stock behind the locomotive. The eye mechanism would use servos mounted in the cab, which were hidden by blacking out the cab, doors, and windows of the locomotives themselves. Unfortunately, the limited range of movement often meant that the eyes would jam, and although the engines couldn't produce smoke, smoke would be emitted from the set under the locomotives to make it look like they did. Due to Rheneas' cab being blacked out, he could only use drivers and firemen that were cut down the middle and then black tacked onto him, but this model would predominantly only see use in the 4th season. It was used in the 5th season for in-between shots, mostly where they would interact with Gauge 1 scaled characters, but after that, the small-scale model wouldn't appear until season 7, only in stock footage in Toby's windmill. Past that, I don't believe it saw much use. In the 4th season episode, A Bad Day for Sir Handel, Rheneas' small-scale model was seen with a lamp, and this was powered by a hidden battery pack inside of his body. For the production of the 4th season episode Grand Puff, Smudger was recycled from Rheneas' model. Instead of repainting the model entirely, his livery was applied using adhesive plastic sheets, and as a result, the inside of his cab and the front of his cylinders were still red. The red from Rheneas' coal bunker and wheel arches can also be seen on Smudger's model. During the production of Season 6, Rheneas' model was refurbished. However, as the small-scale models of the narrow gauge engines were subsided by the large-scale models, Rheneas' repaint would go unfinished, and his weathering and matte varnish would not be applied. As of May 2021, Rheneas' small-scale model, along with his name board, is now owned and preserved by Twitter user TomsProps, with his face masks and coal loads being supplied by Thomas Tank Merch. Much like Skarloey, Rheneas also had an O-gauge model that was large-scale. These were made for ease of filming and reliability in the 5th season. From the 6th to 12th seasons, these models were used exclusively, and these models themselves were closer to 16mm scale, but slightly larger. This model would have 13 different facial expressions sculpted for it, but only 12 would ever be used on screen. One of his tired faces would be left unused, and just like the last, these faces were sculpted in clay, and from that resin casts were made of a silicone mold. This model was made from brass. Though wheels and chassis were custom machined, the model itself was track powered, so pickup contacts were attached to the metal wheels, which ran power to the motor itself. The eye mechanisms would more or less mirror the Gauge 1 models, being that they would have 2 servos, one for up and down movement and one for left and right movement, with each one attached to a rod that was attached to an arm and then connected to a bracket. The eyeballs would be coupled into the bracket and locked in place by the faceplate, so when the servos were powered, the eyeballs would move however the crew wanted. For the 11th season episode, Wash Behind Your Buffers, Rheneas' large-scale model was briefly cleaned to give him a shiny and clean appearance. No second model of Rheneas was ever built, unlike Skarloey, due to the large-scale model being in a state where it could actually be cleaned. After filming, the model would again be weathered. In the 9th season episode, Tuneful Toots, and the 12th season episode, The Man in the Hills, Rheneas' large-scale model is seen with a lamp. This is powered with a hidden battery pack. And throughout the series, the model would have several different modifications. In Season 5, his silver buffers would be changed to gray ones. He would also gain a slightly bigger nose and eyes. In Season 6, his paint was given a matte finish, with his silver buffers being changed to black ones. His whistle sound changed to Peter Sam's original whistle. His model was significantly less weathered, and he gained slightly thicker eyebrows. And then in Season 9, he gained a permanent tail lamp, and his pupils became slightly larger. Throughout the hit era, Skarloey and Rheneas were often incorrectly seen wearing each other's face masks, but thankfully, the large-scale model of Rheneas is currently on display at the Horror Model Railway Museum. Currently, it's wearing his laughing face mask, and one of his nameplates is actually owned by Twitter user Isaac M6991. So at this point in the video, I normally talk about close-up models. Close-up models were required for scenes where engines had to interact with the close-up scale human figures. And believe it or not, Rheneas was the only narrow-gauge engine from the original 7 to not have his own close-up model. In the 5th season episode, Rusty in the Boulder, a close-up shot of Rheneas' driver was actually required, but a close-up model of Rheneas didn't exist. So Rusty's close-up model was briefly used instead. This was achieved by a close-up shot of Rusty's circular cab porthole window, which resembles that of Rheneas's. That's very mind-blowing to me, and I don't know how I didn't see that as a kid, but yeah, the more you know, I guess. So, as we all know, in 2009, the series would switch to CGI. It wouldn't be until 2012, in Blue Mountain Mystery, that we'd see Rheneas and the other narrow gauge characters again. His model, like others, was hand-sculpted in Maya, a 3D animation and modeling software. Photographs of Rheneas' large-scale model were used for reference, but in addition, Nitrogen Studios would also go to the Talyklyn Railway. They would take measurements of Rheneas' basis, Dolgach, so that his CGI model would resemble it as closely as possible. A recolored version of Rheneas was made for a brief scene in the post-credits of Blue Mountain Mystery, where he was repainted yellow with blue lining to play a joke on Thomas, but unfortunately Rheneas' history sort of ends there. Much like Skarloey, Rheneas is one of the most important locomotives in the Thomas & Friends series. He's one of the oldest and one of the wisest, which 1 makes the hit era even harder for me to watch, but 2 also makes me appreciate the character that much more. Going into this, I really didn't know a whole lot about Rheneas' history, but being so enlightened and now knowing so much, I feel like there's even more to appreciate, and hopefully you guys are leaving this video with that same idea. Thank you again to everyone who voted in this week's poll, and if you guys have any ideas on who should be next, be sure to comment down below. I'll do my best to do the next poll a bit more early this time, so we have a good idea of who's going to be next a bit sooner. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe for even more train content, and as always, thank you guys again for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.